Good morning, everybody, and thank you to a session we've not yet had before as part of our CPD series, and it's sort of part of a focus that we've been having in the last few months on mental health. So we've had sessions on depression, there's ones on anxiety, there's ones on schizophrenia, and we've actually been recording them all, and we're bringing them very much on a focus on the DSM V. So a lot of you might have been trained already on the DSM 4, some of us even on the DSM 3 criteria. And today we're going to particularly looking at the DSM 5 criteria, but also the DSM 5 is already being very much interpreted in a different way when we look at adults. And so I want to focus specifically today on the autistic adult, mainly because it is a diagnosis that is so often missed. And especially in our rural communities, it's a concept that's quite often not even known at all, and quite often being mistaken for other things. So what I'm going to cover today is we're going to talk a little bit about why it matters, and then we're going to talk a little bit about trying to understand what the difference is between the autistic mind and the neurotypical mind. And then we're going to look at the DSM-5 criteria. So part one and part, we're going to sort of break it into two sections. I'm going to look at some of the additional things that affect people with autism in terms of other factors over and above what we know in the DSM-5. And we're going to talk a little bit also about the strengths of autistic people and the perspectives that they have. So first, let's just look a little bit about why we're talking about autism and why it matters. And I particularly want to talk in terms of how the paradigm is shifting. So quite often when people think of autism spectrum or they hear the word autism spectrum, they think it's sort of a linear thing, with some people being less autistic and some people being more autistic. But we now understand that autism is much more of a multidimensional perspective of how the brain works and how the brain processes information. And different people divide it up in different ways, but there's lots of different aspects of how the brain works with information. And every autistic person will have a different configuration of how their particular mind works with information, similar to us as neurotypical people. So people who are neurotypical will have a particular where, you know, there's lots of variety, and the same with people who are autistic. There's also a wide range of different functioning. And there's been a massive shift, and especially this word neurodiversity that's trying to move away from looking at autism as something that is a disease or a disorder or something that is abnormal. And we're looking much more now as this is something that's part of somebody's identity. It's a way that the brain works. It's lifelong, it's pervasive, it's perspectives that you are born with, and it's highly diverse. So within what we call autism, there are lots of different diversity and variety. And part of the challenge is that people quite often have a stereotypical idea of what autism actually looks like. The reason why we talk about it as a disability is that the disability side of it arises actually from the poor fit between the person and their environment. So, for example, if we think of people who are left-handed and right-handed, we know that left-handed is a part of human diversity. It's just the way the brain is wired. But we still live in a society where everybody buys scissors that's made for right-handed people. So we have this challenge that the way you work and the way your brain works just struggles to fit in with a society that's mainly based around what we call neurotypical, which is your non-diverse alternative. So there's a huge focus now on changing this narrative of autism away from preventing it or curing it, or, you know, there's always a lot of focus as if it's this terrible thing, and really start looking at understanding diversity. We still use a diagnosis, and it's still important to be able to help people identify if they are autistic, because it gives them certain legal rights. So for example, at school or at university, they can get certain accommodations in terms of their exams, in terms of their studying, in terms of their environment. And it can also help us to provide the support they need in a world that's not really made for autistic people. So there's a lot of things that's changed, therefore, in the language also to be more appropriate and more politically correct. So autism is not seen as a disease or disorder. So it's part of identity. So we talk about autistic people rather than people with autism. We're talking about difference. So the word disorder is no longer used, or is no longer appropriate to say that somebody's got autistic spectrum disorder. We can talk about the autistic spectrum, or we can say that somebody is autistic. And very much there's a recognition that it has both strengths and challenges, rather than looking at it as this as something that's just problematic. One of the older terms is something called Asperger's syndrome that no longer appears in the DSM-5. It was in one of the previous DSMs. And that's largely to do with the history. I don't know if you know who Dr. Asperger was. He was an Austrian during the Second World War. He identified all the children with disabilities, including those with autism. And he identified children with autism that was high functioning, so children who had special gifts, and those were not sent to the gas chamber, and the others he killed. And so this is not seen as an appropriate person to name anything after, really. And therefore, a lot of people find this term highly offensive. There are still people with Asperger's who was diagnosed 10, 20 years ago and sort of owned it as a name and call themselves Aspies, and that's also fine, but you certainly will not use it in terms of diagnosing somebody now. We also no longer use these terms high functioning or low functioning. It's similar that we don't talk about neurotypical people as being high functioning and low functioning, but we talk about levels of support. So even within the DSM, if you identify somebody as being autistic, you will then talk about the level of support they need, level 1, level 2, or level 3 support. Also important is that within the world of autism, there's quite big challenges in terms of these different perspectives. So the symbols at the top, the infinity symbol is what's being used for autism now. There are organizations like Autism Speaks that uses the little puzzle blocks. This is no longer seen as appropriate. Autism Speaks are run by parents of autistic children and healthcare providers working with autism, mostly in America. And it's very much a drive to get autistic kids to behave like neurotypical kids. And they have a whole program they put these kids through that works with rewards and punishment. It's quite severe. There's now adults that's been identified with post-traumatic stress disorder of what they've been put through as children to make them behave like neurotypical kids. And so there's quite a lot of sensitivity around some of these organizations that are still trying to, talk about aborting kids if you could identify autism beforehand, wanting to find the gene and still treating it as a disorder. So just in terms of prevalence, and of course, prevalence is difficult because it depends on actually picking up everybody that is. Sort of global prevalence sits at about 4.3% in males and 1.14% in females. This is quite often in children when we diagnose them. What they have noticed, though, with adults is that the differences between men and women are much less. And this is not because there are less autistic girls, it's because we're not diagnosing autistic girls. Stats in South Africa is very, very little and brief. So there was a study done by UCT and their Neurodiversity Center where they looked at all the schools sort of in the Western Cape area. And the prevalence of diagnosed autism in the schools were 0.08%. But most of them were white kids, English-speaking kids, and in middle privileged schools in the central Western Cape. So only 17% of those children had been diagnosed in rural schools. We know from our stats that there's not a higher prevalence that's due to ethnicity. We don't even think there's a higher prevalence due to gender, really. And this is mainly to do with our missing the diagnosis in those populations. 70 to 95% of autistic people have other mental health conditions. So there's definitely associations. For example, there's this higher prevalence of bipolar. There's a higher prevalence of schizophrenia, not dramatically, but some. But also of them will have disorders as a result of this misfit, especially anxiety disorders. So if you're struggling within a world that's not friendly to you, you might have much higher level of anxiety, much higher level of trauma. And so if you look at within a mental health institution within, for example, our Ward 13 here, there will be a much higher percentage of people with mental health diagnoses will actually also be autistic and has not been necessarily diagnosed. And then they think that only 2 to 10% of autistic adults have actually been diagnosed. And we're actually missing the diagnosis in most people because the DSM has been so limited and been so much looking at sort of stereotypical ways of looking at that. And we can see how the prevalence has increased as we are becoming better at understanding and identifying autism. The challenge of being autistic, as I've mentioned, has to do with this mismatch. And there's two major things that happen. The one is overwhelm, and we'll talk about how autistic minds work. And the other one is just misunderstanding, either being misunderstood or misunderstanding other people because of this different ways of processing information. What happens as a result is certain autistic behaviors. And it's important to understand that the behaviors we typically associate with autism is a result of the way that they're processing information. That is not the core issue. So the core issue is not the behavior is just a symptom of how they are managing their autism. And that is why the behaviors can be so variable, because there'll be different behaviors depending on how somebody is coping. So what is also happening is the neurotypical world. So these are people who do not have neurodivergent brains. There's an expectation, and the world generally works like that the minority has to change and adopt to the majority. So there's very little patience with people that are autistic for being different or behaving differently or needing accommodations. And autistics are often blamed and shamed for their behavior and excluded and bullied because of it. So diagnosis is very empowering, and especially when it's neurodiversity affirming. So if you can, a biggest gift you can give somebody who's autistic is for them to have a non-judgmental understanding of how they are different, and understanding that they are not less or not invalid, or that there's not actually anything wrong with them. So one of the biggest challenges with why we're seeing such a difficulty in diagnosing autistic is because of the ability of autistic people, some more than others, to blend in or mask. It's also called camouflaging. And they basically develop compensatory techniques to cope or blend in with their environment. So, and this is much more in girls and people of color and certain cultures like your Asian cultures. So just an example here for all our Black kids. How many of you, what happens if you're rude to your mom? Hey, oh, yeah. I can get you out. Not acceptable to be rude to your mother, but in your very sort of privileged white boys, especially, they can get away with murder, basically. And so what happens is that if you're growing up in a household where certain behaviors are simply not tolerated, you might have to learn to actually adopt behaviors that might not make sense to yourself, might not feel natural, might be very stressful. But therefore you sort of can learn to pass. And you'll often find people go, well, actually, but you don't look autistic, so you can't be autistic. And that might actually be somebody who's got a lot of blending or masking that they've done to try and fit into a world that finds it unacceptable. And it's one of the reasons why we're missing so much of the diagnosis. So these masking blending techniques usually works in certain situations because they don't really understand why they're supposed to do this, but they've learned that this is the way you do things, like eye contact. But now eye contact in one situation might be appropriate, but it might not be very appropriate in another situation. And so what one finds is that sometimes things start going wrong. To be able to blend in and mask requires significant cognitive, emotional, and sensory resources. It's exhausting. It causes anxiety. It is extremely difficult. So being autistic then makes your life much harder as you're trying to navigate through this neurotypical world. And it makes it very hard to diagnose. And actually the one-to-one structured interviews, sitting down with somebody, is the most ideal situation to mask in. Nice and structured, you know roughly what to expect. It's quite quiet over. Well, so actually it's quite hard in a medical consultation, for example, people will be able to mask much better. And these behaviors are going to come out much more within large groups, for example, or other scenarios. So one of the challenges also is that people get invalidated. Oh, no, you can't be autistic. Not true. Or they get misdiagnosed. So the focus is on their anxiety or on obsessive behaviors, or they get diagnosed with mood disorders, etc. So the kinds of things people might do to be able to mask is that they learn to copy what other people do. They might actually, some people actually write up scripts to be able to know what to say in certain scenarios. They learn that eye contact is important, so they try and look just above the eyes, for example, to be able to make contact. And they might change their voice and their gestures to try and sound more like neurotypicals, again, copying, not really understanding and they hide certain behaviors and ignore when they are actually having sensory issues. So let's just have a little look at understanding how autistic people process information. So we speak about the neurodiversity